They said a spirit guarded the last live spring in the Cimarron Valley, a vengeful giant, vast and ancient as the cracked earth itself. But Silas Kane wasn't a man who believed in spirits. He was a rancher, half broken by a 2-year drought, and he was just trying to keep his last few cattle from turning to dust. He followed the whispers of running water not for a myth, but for survival. What he found chained to the source of the spring, however, was something far more impossible than a spirit. She was a woman of immense size, an Apache, her powerful body a landscape of defiance and exhaustion, bound to the rock by a heavy industrial-grade iron collar and chain. The law was absolute. She was the property of the railroad, a captured hostile, and the bounty for turning her in would save his ranch. But when she finally raised her head, he saw not the face of a savage, but of a human being pushed beyond the limits of all endurance. She didn't speak of war or curses. Her voice was a raw, broken whisper that stripped away law, race, and reason, leaving only a devastating choice. "I am begging you," she pleaded, her eyes locking onto his. "Take it off." Silas froze, the dust and the heat and the buzz of the horseflies fading into a dull, distant hum. His gaze dropped from her eyes to the source of her plea. It wasn't the collar. It was the small beaded leather pouch tied on a cord beneath it. The cord was so tight it had buried itself in her flesh, creating a raw, angry line against her skin. The pouch itself pulsed with her ragged breaths. He saw now that her hands, bound behind her, were clenched not in fists of rage, but in fists of desperate, silent prayer. This wasn't about defiance. It was about something holy. The rational part of his brain, the part that had survived 10 years of frontier hardship since Mary and the boy were taken by the fever, screamed at him. The bounty on a hostile Apache was $500. Enough to pay off the bank, buy feed, survive another year. Enough to stop the slow, agonizing bleed of failure that had defined his life since he had failed to protect his own family. $500 was a resurrection. All he had to do was get on his horse and ride to the railroad camp. But his body wouldn't move. His boots felt welded to the cracked earth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a hostile, but the ghost of his own powerlessness, the same raw helplessness he'd seen in Mary's eyes as the fever took her. With a curse that was half a prayer, Silas slid the heavy crowbar from the loops on his saddle. He wedged the tip into the link of the chain where it was bolted to the rock, the shriek of metal on metal, a sound of finality. He threw his weight against it once, twice, a grunt tearing from his lungs with the effort. On the third heave, the bolt shrieked one last time and snapped free. The heavy chain clattered to the ground, a dead iron snake in the dust. She didn't run. She didn't even stand. She simply slumped forward, the weight of the collar on her neck almost pulling her face into the dirt before she caught herself on her hands. Silas approached her cautiously, canteen in hand. He knelt, his knees cracking, and offered it. She watched his hands, her eyes sharp and assessing. Slowly, she drank, long and deep, the water tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. He saw then that the heavy iron collar was a masterwork of cruelty, forged in a railroad smithy and locked with a heavy specialized pin. There was no keyhole. It couldn't be picked. It could only be broken by the same force that had forged it. He had freed her from the rock, but not from her prison. By breaking that chain, he'd just signed his own death warrant. He had chosen. He had betrayed his own kind, the world of law and order, for a silent, captive woman he didn't even know. The bounty was gone, and the railroad would send men. The question wasn't if they would come, but when. And what in God's name was he going to do with her now? The riders appeared 3 days later, ghosts of dust on the horizon that slowly resolved into 3 men. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He'd hidden Nita in the small, cramped root cellar, a place that smelled of damp earth and memories. He met the men on his porch, his hand resting casually on the worn stock of the Winchester leaning against the doorframe. The man in the lead was immaculate, his clothes clean despite the trail, his face a mask of polite efficiency. It was Marcus Thorne. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Kane," Thorne said, his voice as smooth and cool as a river stone. "A pleasure," he offered a folded paper. "This is a final notice of foreclosure from the Denver Rio Grande Western Railroad Bank. You have 30 days to vacate the property." Silas took the paper, his knuckles white. It wasn't a threat. It It was a simple statement of fact which made it all the more terrifying. Thorne's eyes, pale and sharp as a hawk's, scanned the homestead. "Times are hard," he said, the words a hollow echo of sympathy. "Progress requires sacrifice." His gaze lingered for a moment on the 2 empty plates Silas had left on the porch railing, a calculated bit of stagecraft. Thorne smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of his lips, and wheeled his horse around. 30 days. It was a death sentence. When they were gone, Silas opened the cellar door. Nita emerged, blinking in the harsh light, her massive form filling the doorway. He held up the paper, the shame of his failure hot on his face. She looked not at the paper, but at his last 3 skeletal cows, their heads drooping near the dry trough. Her silence was a heavy thing, full of an observation that made him feel small. She gestured with her head towards the rocky bluff at the far edge of his property, a place he'd always considered useless, barren rock. Then she started walking. He followed her, confused and angry. She moved with a strange, ground-eating grace, her bare feet seeming to find purchase where his worn boots slipped. She led him to a small, almost invisible crevice, hidden behind a curtain of sun-bleached manzanita, and there, at the bottom of the crevice, was a dark, damp patch of earth. A seep. It wasn't much, but it was water. She looked at him then, a long, level gaze. She had just saved what was left of his world, and in that silent, shared look, something shifted between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was the quiet, profound respect of 2 survivors. The foreclosure notice still felt like a noose around his neck, but for the first time in a week, he could breathe. The real trouble came a week later, at dusk. This time, there was no polite warning. Thorne's men, 5 of them, rode hard into his yard, their rifles already drawn. Silas barely had time to shove Nita back down into the root cellar and cover the door with an old horse blanket before they were on him. "We're looking for escaped railroad property, Kane," one of them snarled, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near his boots. "Big Apache woman. Seen her?" Silas shook his head, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Ain't seen nothing but dust and misery out here." They searched the barn, kicking over what little he had, their cruelty a casual thing. As one of the men started prodding the horse blanket covering the cellar door with his rifle barrel, Silas knew it was over. But then Nita's voice, low and urgent, came from beneath his feet, not a plea, but a command. "Silas, down here, now!" He hesitated for only a second, before dropping through a hidden trapdoor in the floorboards he'd forgotten was even there. He landed in the tight, dark space beside her. Above, he could hear the men shouting in confusion and anger. He was a fugitive on his own land, trapped. It was in that suffocating darkness, with the footsteps of his hunters just inches above their heads, that she finally broke her silence. She pointed to the pouch. "Not for me," she whispered, the words costing her a visible effort. She gestured to the east, toward the jagged peaks where the main railroad camp was carved into the mountainside. "For my brother. He is a boy. They took him. His spirit is in this pouch. His body is in that camp." The full, devastating weight of his decision crashed down on him. This was not about saving a lone woman from a cruel fate. It was about liberating a child from a slave camp. His blood ran cold. He looked at the pouch, at the raw, festering line it cut into her neck, and then back at her eyes. They were filled not with fear, but with the unyielding fire of a warrior with a sacred mission. The foreclosure, his ranch, his very life. It all felt small and meaningless in the face of this. This was a war he could not possibly win. They made their move under the cover of a moonless night 2 weeks later, following a winding, treacherous goat path Nita knew from her childhood. From a high ridge, they could see the camp below, a hellish sprawl of tents and firelight, the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel, a constant, brutal heartbeat. It was a fortress, crawling with armed guards. Silas felt the familiar bitter taste of powerlessness rise in his throat. This was madness. They slipped down the scree slope, using the shadows as their only cover. They were almost at the edge of the camp, near a cluster of holding pens, when a dog started barking, a frantic, high-pitched alarm. A lantern flared to life. A shot rang out, then another. Shouts erupted from the camp. They were spotted. They turned and ran, adrenaline and terror, a fire in their veins. Another shot, and Silas felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through his leg. He fell, his leg buckling beneath him, the ground rushing up to meet him. Nita was beside him in an instant. With a strength that seemed impossible, she hoisted him onto her broad back, his weight barely seeming to slow her as she scrambled back up the rocky incline, the shouts and gunshots of their pursuers echoing behind them. She carried him for what felt like miles, finally collapsing in a hidden, shallow cave as the first gray light of dawn stained the eastern sky. The mission was a catastrophic failure. He was wounded, and they were hunted. As a wave of fever and pain-induced delirium washed over him, the cave walls seemed to transform into the cramped walls of his own small cabin years ago. He could almost smell the cloying scent of sickness, see Mary's face, pale and sweaty, her eyes wide with the same fear and pain that was now consuming him. He had failed again. Another life he was responsible for, another person he was too weak, too poor, too powerless to save. As Nita worked, tearing a strip from her own dress to bind his wound, her movements swift and sure, a strange detail snagged in his fevered brain. Through the pain, he saw that she wasn't looking back the way they came. She wasn't watching for their pursuers. Her gaze was fixed on the camp in the distance, but on something specific, something he'd barely noticed. She was staring intently at the camp's tall, solitary water tower, shimmering like a ghost in the morning light. The fever broke on the third day, leaving Silas weak but clear-headed, the ghosts of his past finally receding. Nita had tended to his wound with a knowledge that went beyond simple frontier remedies, her hands gentle but sure. As he lay there, watching her, a realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about Nita or her brother or even the railroad. It was about Mary and his son. He hadn't been able to save them. The world had been too big, too cruel, and he had been too small. He had hidden from that failure for a decade behind a mask of weary pragmatism, telling himself he cared for nothing but the dirt under his boots. It was a lie. He hadn't been hiding. He'd been waiting for a second chance to face the same test and not be found wanting. This was atonement. He finally sat up, the pain in his leg a sharp, clean thing. "The water tower," he said, his voice raspy. "You were watching the water tower." Nita nodded, her gaze never leaving the distant camp. "It is fed by a small creek, a creek that runs through the pass 2 miles north of here." She looked at him then, her eyes conveying a plan so simple, so audacious, that it took his breath away. They would not fight Thorne's men. They would fight the drought. "The camp has men," she said, her voice low and steady, "but men need water. We will take their water, and when they are thirsty, they will be blind." The brilliance of it settled over him, a warm and terrible thing. It was an aha moment so pure it felt like a gift from God himself. They would use the tools of their own suffering, the harsh landscape, the relentless drought, as their greatest weapon. The intense anticipation of the fight to come was a fire in his blood, burning away the last dregs of his old fear. It took them 2 days of brutal, back-breaking labor. They didn't need dynamite. They used Silas's crowbar, Nita's immense strength, and their shared knowledge of the land to collapse a narrow section of the canyon wall, diverting the creek's slow, tired trickle into a dry wash that led away from the camp. Then they waited. The chaos started on the second day. Shouts echoed up the canyon walls, followed by the frantic ringing of a bell. Nita's plan had worked perfectly. By noon, Thorne had sent a full quarter of his men scrambling up the canyon to find the source of the blockage, leaving the main camp in a state of confused disarray. That was their opening. They slipped into the camp like ghosts, the remaining guards distracted by the water crisis. Nita led the way to the holding pens, her every movement a whisper. She found him instantly, a small, stick-thin boy with her same defiant eyes. There were 4 other children with him, their faces hollow with hunger and fear. There was no time for tears. Silas used the last of his strength to break the cheap locks on the pens, while Nita gathered the children, speaking to them in the low, urgent tones of their native tongue. Just as they were leading the children out, Thorne appeared, his face a mask of disbelief hardening into cold fury. He wasn't flanked by guards. They were all gone, chasing the ghost of a creek. It was just him, Silas, and Nita. Thorne drew his pistol, but before he could fire, Nita did something Silas never expected. She shoved the children behind her and charged, not with a weapon, but with a roar of pure primal rage. She was Nita the bear, an unstoppable force of nature, and Thorne, for all his power and authority, was just a man. He fired once, wildly, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall as Nita's full weight slammed into him, sending them both tumbling into the dust. The gun skittered away. Silas, his legs screaming in protest, limped forward, leveled his Winchester at Thorne's head, and ended it. In the ringing silence that followed, Nita slowly rose to her feet, helped her brother up, and led the other children away without a backward glance. They melted back into the wilderness that was their home, leaving Silas alone in the silent, defeated camp. Weeks later, the foreclosure notice was a forgotten scrap of paper. The railroad camp was a ghost town, its progress halted indefinitely by the mysterious loss of its only water source. Silas's ranch, however, was on the brink of a resurrection. He wasn't alone. Nita and her brother, Taza, had returned, not as guests, but as partners. She had shown him where to dig, guiding him with an ancient knowledge of the land that felt like magic. The final image of their new life wasn't a kiss. It was the three of them, Silas, his bad leg now healing, Nita, her iron collar finally broken and discarded, and Taza, his strength returning, working together, their hands in the cool, dark earth, deepening the well that would save their home. Silas leaned on his shovel, the sun warm on his face, and watched them. He thought a legacy was something you owned, like land, a deed in a lockbox. But now he knew that was wrong. A true legacy was something you built, something that grew, something that lived. Like a well, like a family.